Let's talk about the 1916 election. It's an election year in 2024. And I don't know why more people aren't talking about the 1906 election. At My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, I have a three-part series on this very important election. It is Woodrow Wilson's re-election. Now, it was a squeaker, and it comes down to one state in about 3,000 votes. And even in 1916, that was close. There are going to be newspapers, for instance, that are printed that day, the Tuesday of the election in 1916, that say Hughes wins. In fact, we know about the 1948, and Truman holds up the newspaper and says Dewey wins. That's the Chicago Tribune. And there were several papers that did that with Hughes in 1916, but it's largely forgotten. It was so close, so close. And one of the reasons is both candidates were not that popular, or as one critic said, were not so much to be enthused about. If you take Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat in the race, there are some groups, African-American voters, who had supported him in large numbers in the 1912 election. W.E.B. Du Bois, extremely disappointed over the resegregation of the federal civil service. German Americans upset with him about calling out hyphenated Americans, saying, implying, and sometimes directly saying that German Americans, Irish Americans were not loyal people. This is all in the midst of a European war, and you have to put yourself back there. We had not faced anything like that, Europe fighting each other for decades. I mean, Grant was president during the Franco-Prussian War. That was some time ago. And now France, Germany, Russia, Britain are all fighting. And we have commerce with all these nations on the high seas. We have ships going across the Atlantic, and we have American passengers very often riding British cruise lines. And famously, the Lusitania, over 100 Americans are killed in that terrible incident. Woodrow Wilson has to respond. And so some, like German American groups, anti-war socialists, think that Wilson is too strong. And others, like Theodore Roosevelt, think that Woodrow Wilson is weak and not standing up to the Germans enough. And Theodore Roosevelt famously says about Woodrow Wilson, he has not yet begun to write, talking about how he writes letters to Germany, but doesn't do anything. But the Republicans are also split. And so they nominate Charles Evans Hughes. And in a way, he's a great candidate. Turns out to be quite the campaigner. He is campaigning in Detroit and sees Ty Cobb on the outfield. They're at Tiger Stadium, and he races down and jumps over the bleachers to shake hands with Ty Cobb. Ty Cobb. He descends into mines. He ascends up mountains in his campaigning. 25,000 miles of campaigning. He'll do a great job with that. But the thing about Charles Evans Hughes is what makes him great is that nobody hates him. And that's important in the Republican Party in 1916 because they're split. In 1912, they just split between the conservatives and Taft and the progressives and Roosevelt. And now they don't want to nominate Roosevelt. He wanted the nomination. They think he's too much of a warmonger. They don't like all of his progressive positions, and they don't like that he split the party. But they got to deal with him. And so the conservatives come up with the candidate Charles Evans Hughes, former governor of New York, now on the Supreme Court. And yes, there hasn't been a candidate since, but we pulled off the Supreme Court to run for president. Charles Evans Hughes was that, and he very nearly became president. And what was great about being a Supreme Court member is that he didn't have to talk about the European war. He didn't have to talk about the issues that split Republican conservatives and progressives. And he could just come out swinging against Wilson, talking about what a bad job Wilson was doing. And so this makes for an exciting election, but the thing that you have to understand is that things are very close. The positions between the candidates are actually pretty close. Theodore Roosevelt calls Hughes a Wilson in whiskers because, as some papers are noting, you're not really saying very much. It sounds like you want to do the same thing Wilson is doing, but slap a Republican label on it. Wilson had changed the country in his first term. I don't think it's something that gets talked about a lot. Passed tariff reform. This is a huge issue for decades in America. The Federal Reserve sort of solving the banking issue, not to everyone's delight, but it was something that Republicans wanted to pass too. Wilson gets it done. The income tax, federal road bill, Farm Credit Act, some significant legislation that even during TR and Taft's terms, they couldn't get done. Wilson gets done. It's a very active president. This also means a lot is changing, and people are a little nervous about that. People are also nervous about the European war and although we're neutral, and Wilson calls for us to be in America, to be neutral in mind and in action, but there's munition factories all over the United States. In fact, there's one in Jersey City that German saboteurs find out about and blow up. So we are sort of in this war, but both candidates are sort of dodging that issue a bit. Hughes will say we need to be firm, and Woodrow Wilson's campaign will be, he kept us out of war. That's his slogan. Very critical distinction to make there is he kept us out of war. There's no promise that he will keep us out of war. In fact, when Wilson hears this slogan, which really comes from his campaign, not from him, he tells his aide Tumulty, I can't keep us out of war. One German submarine could put us into a war. And so this is a dicey time. America will enter World War I the next year, but that isn't known yet. Some people strongly suspect it. And so this very tight election, so tight that some groups that we normally don't think about are going to play a role. First of all, socialists. Socialists, isn't that like Socialist Party? Don't they run in elections and get 100 votes or something like that, or have a little office on the second floor of Ashtabula, Ohio or something? No. Socialists had received nearly 1 million votes in the 1912 election. They are a force in 1916. And the decision of socialist voters will be critical in this election. Women voters. Wait a second, Bruce. What are you talking about? It's 1916. I see the years behind it. 1960. The amendment's not passed yet. No. 12 states allowed women to vote, and that included presidential elections. And there's some big states like Illinois and California. And those voters will be critical also in this election. Labor. For the first time, you have a president making a direct appeal to organize labor, not just talking about, oh, the working man is so great, or we support the tariffs because we help working men, as had been done years or years, but specific legislation. Wilson passes the Clayton Act, which makes, in effect, unions legal. Had they been legal before? Yes, but they could be sued like monopolies. You got together as a group of workers, you're the same as Rockefeller, and we're going to break you. That's what the courts were saying. Wilson ends that with the Clayton Act. That is significant. Labor leaders are out there saying, you know, it used to be more even, and you were losing to socialists a lot. Socialists were very popular with labor this time. But now, you know, Hughes is in third place. Wilson's number one with our groups, and Hughes is third, socialists in the middle. There'd be a railroad strike in the middle of this election, in which Wilson is going to pass legislation that creates the 8-hour workday. Yes, this year's election creates 8 hours as the standard of a workday. It doesn't mean people are going to stop working at 8 hours. It just means that's how you calculate what a workday is. Businesses wanted it at 10. Editorial comment, but I'll say more likely Hughes and Republicans wanted it at 10, where business wanted it. Wilson put it at 8. Big issue in this election is going to help votes. But there's a lot against Wilson as well. In fact, most people think that Hughes is going to win this election. Wilson only won the 1912 because the Republican Party was split, and they're not as split now. It'll come down to California, and it'll come down to 3,700 votes. And we talk about this critical election where you have an unpopular incumbent and a challenger that some people find the speeches are a little flat. He doesn't want to offend anyone. Two candidates that American voters maybe aren't enthused about. Gee, what could that possibly say about 2024? Listen to the podcast. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. I'll talk more and more and more about this election. It's a 3-part series. Find us on YouTube or find us wherever you get podcasts.